Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is a young adult fantasy author whose books feature mystery, magic, and a witty dialogue. Her newest book, titled Thief, Liar, Lady, is now available in bookstores everywhere and Audible. Please welcome Destiny DL Soria. How are you doing? Did I say it right? I know there was seen there's issues. It's like Gloria, but Soria, that's how it's pronounced.
Yes, you said it right. Thank
Yes,
you.
I nailed it. Awesome. I'm curious, could you tell us in the audience the story of your, because for a while you were Destiny Soria, and now, your newest book is DL Soria. What was kind of the antithesis for that transfer, that little change in the newest book?
It's pretty simple. My earlier books, Iron Cast, Beneath the Citadel, and Fire with Fire, are all young adult fantasy, and Thief, Liar, Lady is my first adult fantasy. So I just wanted to sort of delineate the difference between my young adult and my adult,
Okay.
so that maybe my teen readers wouldn't accidentally pick up something that
Oh,
they didn't want to read, which is not to say they can't read it if they don't want to. I know when I was a teenager, I was reading way above my pay grade, but
right.
I wanted them to be separated on the shelves, basically.
Or vice versa. Sometimes, actually more often than not, a lot of young adult is read by adults. It's
Yep.
very popular, especially these days. It's been quite the trend to read the young adult, and I think it's to be able to go. I don't have to worry about all the adult themes I worry about day to day. I can just enjoy this, enjoy this story. So it's
Yeah. Well,
nice to know that it wasn't.
I've already had people who are like, oh, I started reading this, and then I realized like halfway through, oh, this is adult. This is not young adult. And I'm like,
Oh,
I guess it didn't make much of a difference to have the different name on there, but okay, I tried.
that's okay. That's okay. I it was because sometimes you never know. Sometimes it's like publishers or whatever are like we need to change your name for whatever reason or this. So I had to find out if this was a you decision, if this was them decision, if it was just like an overall, or if it just was happenstance. So I had to ask. I was like, let's lead off with this because people are going to be curious about that change, about the little delineation or difference between that and this. So it's good to know, and we'll definitely talk about some of those books here in a bit. Um, let's rewind a little bit. Let's go back a little bit further. Was Destiny as a child a writer, very attendant and good in school and liked to do writing and that kind of stuff, or were you not?
Well, let's see. I found an old diary of mine back when I was probably like 6 or 7, in which I expounded on how much I hated English and how much I loved math. And I wish I never had to do English again. I just want to do math my whole life. And then, literally, in the next few years, it completely swapped over. Now I can't do math at all. I regularly have to ask my friends to do simple multiplication for me.
I'm right there with
Um,
that.
but I love English, obviously, and I majored in literature, and I wrote my first book when I was it must have been very soon after I wrote that diary entry. I guess I changed my mind pretty fast, but I wrote a book called Horses of All Kinds that was written on notebook paper with illustrations done in crayon of, you guessed it, horses of all kinds. And it was a gift from my aunt, and that was my very first book. And I have been writing ever since.
That's great. Any thoughts of like bringing that into the modern and redoing it, redoing the?
Doing a modern novel of horses of all kinds.
Yeah.
Well, one of them was because they each had their own like name and then like what was special about them, and one of them was named Balls because he had balls all over. I,
uh,
you know, I'm sure it was literary genius at the time. I mean, my mom thinks that it was a really good book,
okay.
so I
Okay.
guess I could always try revamping that.
It'd be funny. Could be complete with the crayon drawings, right?
Yeah, my aunt still has it actually, so I could just scan it in and be like,
Oh, that'd be
publish
great.
this,
That's if
done.
nothing else, you just put it as like a blog or on a post somewhere someday. Be like, this is then and this is now, or anything like that. You mentioned college. How much did you enjoy college? Was that the purpose? Was like I want to write books, so I'm going to go to college and to do literary stuff, and that was the whole point, or was it just like you were there and you kind of found your way while you were in college?
Um, well, I started off as a journalism mass comm major, and then I realized I wasn't a big fan of journalism or mass comm, and sort of got lured away by the English department because I was like, "Oh, I can just read books and, like, talk about them for 4 years. Like, why wouldn't I do that instead?" And, the English professor I was talking to was like, "Yeah, if you think that, then you need to be an English major." So, so that's kinda how I got into that, and at the time, I was writing a lot, and I did start writing the book that would eventually get my agent, even though it wasn't my first book that was published. I did start writing that in college, but I didn't really get serious about getting published until after college because I had thought in my head that getting published was more of like an older person thing of like, oh, you've got to be like 40 or 50 to get
Yeah,
published.
yeah.
Um, and then one of my really good friends in college, Catherine Ormsby, actually got her first middle grade published. Um, and she publishes middle grade and YA now. I think she has some graphic novels coming out with Disney. Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
Um, but after I saw that, I was like, "Oh, she's, 22 or whatever, and she's got her first book published." I was like, "Oh, so you can just kinda do it whenever you're ready to do it."
Yeah, for sure.
So after that, I really, I kind of, put my head down, started, researching everything, and really she helped me a lot, along the way. It helps a lot to have somebody who's already been through it to sort of give you pointers, so I owe a lot of that to her. Yeah, and then my first book, Ironcast, came out in 2016 when I was 26 years old.
What was the process for you? You talked about getting your agent. What was, because not everybody does that right away. Not everybody starts off. Some people don't even know how to do that. What was kind of your process of getting a literary agent at the beginning there?
I followed what is probably what's considered the most quote unquote standard way of getting a literary agent, which is that you have your manuscript. And I'm talking about fiction here. You have your manuscript, you write query letters to the agents that you would be interested in representing you. The query letter is basically like a here's what my book is about, here is why I think you would be interested in representing me. And it's a very long and grueling process. Lots of people are at it for years and years and years before they find an agent. I was pretty lucky and queried for less than a year before I got my offer. But yeah, it was a pretty. I lots of people put a lot more research into it than I did, which I admire. I literally Googled literary agents, YA fantasy, and then just kind of went down with a list.
Right.
And then did research on the individual agents to like make sure that they represented books that were like the books that I figured I would be writing in my career.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, it started off pretty, literally just a Google search. And then I kind of dug in and started making my spreadsheet, and that's when all the rejections start rolling in. Uh, but yeah, like I said, I was pretty lucky in that I signed with my agent less than a year after I started querying.
Okay, that's great. That's actually a pretty good turnaround for time, though. From all the people I've talked to about that process, like that is fairly quick. So that's awesome.
It happens like that sometimes.
I had read, and correct me if I'm wrong, I had read that you have a little bit of history with tabletop role playing and Dungeons and Dragons. Is that accurate?
Yes, just a little bit though.
Just a little bit. Are you being facetious when you're saying just a little bit?
No, I'm being serious because my my group was actually my current. Well, they started off as my writing critique group. Now they are just like my friend group,
Okay.
but we all sort of discovered several years ago that we're like, hey, we all kind of want to try D&D. I I always was really interested in it in high school, but and this is not me being facetious. I didn't think I was cool enough to like do it. I don't know. I thought all the people who like played it were like so like cool and interesting, and I was like, I'm not that. I was like, I can't do that. I was very shy in high school. So yeah, I'm a little bit sad that I wasted all that time not doing it. But then yeah, me and my friend group, we just did like virtual sessions, but we lost one of our players, so we haven't started
Oh,
back yet. So I've been, kind of looking around for a group, but it's kind of hard to find, a group that fits your schedule. But yeah, it is something that I really like to do.
have you done anything besides D&D, any of the other type of games out there? Because there's so many genres and things, from superheroes and just other versions of fantasy, or modern day stuff. I mean, there's a million different tabletop role playing games out there. Have you done more than D&D, or have you pretty much stuck to D&D?
I actually just for the first time a couple weeks ago tried out a game of Blood on the Clock Tower,
Okay.
which I had never heard of before. But I just moved to South Carolina from Alabama this month, so I was just kind of looking around at different groups, trying to like, see where I could plug in. And this group does a game every Saturday, and I was like, I've never heard of this before, but I googled it, and I was like, sounds cool, like
Yeah,
like mafia on steroids. So yeah, so I joined that group and played a game a couple weeks ago. It was really fun.
that's great. Have you ever thought about doing like a tie-in fiction, tie into any of the D&D or that game or anything of that nature, with your writing as well? Being that you've played it and you kind of understand that, because we have a lot of authors and guests on here who do, they've written D&D books, or they've written for like a Mutants and Mastermind system or any of that kind of stuff. Have you ever thought about doing anything in that genre, or are you planning to just stick to what you've been doing so far?
I mean, I've thought about it. I I wouldn't know how to get started, I guess. So if anybody watching, is a publisher or something out there, like, sure, I'll do it. If you want to
Okay.
send me the offer, but I can't say it's something that I have pursued necessarily.
Yeah. For role playing, do you prefer to be a player or a GM? I ask this everybody who has ever role played. GM or player, or
Oh
DM or
my God,
player,
it's
depending on what kind
hard.
of you.
I like both for different reasons. I like being a player because I always play chaotic neutral because I just like making a nuisance of myself, and just doing whatever I want. Um, but I also really like being a DM because it is a lot like writing a book. But the fun thing is that it can get away from you a lot faster than a book can, which is not to say that books don't get away from you, because they do. The characters take on minds of their own, but in this, in games like D&D, the players get to make their own decisions, and so having to sort of think on your feet and have um all these different ideas in play all the time is really fun. Our DM for our games is a genius and always such a sport when she would come up with like the most amazing settings and cities and things, and then we would end up going off in a completely different direction and
Right.
doing something totally different. And she would just roll with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. That's the joy of role playing. You mentioned about how characters that you're writing can get away from you. Are you the kind of person who like kind of writes by the seat of their pants? You have kind of an idea and then you just go and see where the story takes you, or are you very much like an outline sort of person, or a combination of the two, or something else?
I am very much a quote unquote pantser, so I don't hardly ever plot my books. I usually have some kind of an idea when I get started. I occasionally know how it's going to end and not how I'm going to get there. But more often than not, I just sort of have the general premise and maybe a couple random scenes in the middle that I know I want to put in, and then I just start writing. I fast draft usually.
Okay.
Fast is relative here. I try to fast draft, but yeah, so I usually have a really messy first draft that is just like complete nonsense. and then I go in and edit that down into something that actually makes sense.
Do you have something that's like this is an inspiration and that's where you get going, or how do you get that initial start on a story or a book?
It happens differently for different books. So, for example, Beneath the Citadel, which is about a group of teens who live in a city that's ruled by prophecy, was inspired by an episode of The Twilight Zone. I was
Okay.
watching it with my roommates. I think it's called The Obsolete Man, but it just starts off with a man who's like on trial in front of this like high chancellor who's up on a dais. Um, and that's really the only thing that kind of it has in common is like I just saw that in my brain just immediately like these characters sort of came to life and like that opening scene just sort of like jumped into my mind's eye and I like got up in the middle of the episode and went and got my laptop and just started like writing little notes to myself and it really just like came from that even though like it doesn't have anything to do with like the Twilight Zone episode itself. Like if you watch the episode you wouldn't
Yeah.
think that it was inspired by that. But yeah, so that was like that's probably one of the weirder ways that I've gotten inspiration.
Is there a reason that you decided to go with your first couple books as young adult books?
Uh yeah, I guess so. Let's see. So I told you, like, I've been writing my whole life.
Yeah.
Um when I was 16, I read a book called The Prophecy of the Stones by uh I'm gonna mispronounce her name, Flavia Boujor. She's French, I think. And she was 16, I think, when she published The Prophecy of the Stones. Um, and I read that book knowing that's how old she was, the same age as me.
Hmm.
And I just fell in love with it. And I was so inspired by the idea that like somebody my age could like accomplish something like that. And that was the age when I first decided that I wanted to be published at some point in my life. Like I really distinctly remember being in my bedroom and thinking, "I'm gonna get published one day. That's what I wanna do with my life." Um, and so, I obviously read a lot of books when I was a high schooler. And then as I got older, I just sort of realized there's a or there used to be a dearth of books with characters that looked like me or were like me in various ways. Um, And the book community has gotten a lot more open about that now, a lot more honest, and publishing has gotten a lot more diverse,
Hmm.
um, with help of like a lot of organizations, like We Need Diverse Books, and uh, people of color in publishing and different organizations like that have made a really big push, and the community itself has made a really big push to make it more inclusive and diverse. But yeah, when I first started writing, I was just kind of struck by the idea of like I want to write books that I would have wanted to read when I was 16 and the books that I wished that I could have had when I was 16.
Yeah.
So that's what was really important to me when I started writing.
I know that some of the reviews that I've read on your books, very many of them specifically mirror everything that you just said. That's what you wanted, and those are reviews that I saw that said this is what I also wanted, and now I finally got it. So that's really cool for you to say that. And I don't know whether or not you read your own reviews or not. Some
I
people do, some
don't.
people don't, but there are plenty of them out there that said, very much mirroring that, even to the point of saying, I can't believe that the cover of this book has somebody that looks like me on it. And I thought that I was like, man, that's really moving. That really means a lot to a lot of people out there because for a very long time, yeah, it was very much one way. Everybody was this, was the same, looked the same. And to get a little bit of diversity and inspiration out there for people is really awesome. And so you've done that. You've accomplished that. So that's great.
Oh, thank you.
Do you have any other inspirations, any other books that were an inspiration for you or are currently an inspiration for you when you're writing?
Let's see. current favorite book is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. Um, in the other room, I have 4 editions of it, have Pride of Place on my, mantle. Um, but yeah, I would say that, uh, hers was a really big inspiration sort of in the fairy tale retelling, which is what Thief, Liar, Lady is. It's a retelling of Cinderella. Um, so she's probably my biggest inspiration, and so, Thief, Liar, Lady is with, Del Rey, which is also Naomi Novik's publisher, so, like, you can imagine my excitement when I got the
Yeah.
offer from Del, and I was like, "That's Naomi Novik's publisher. Maybe one day I can meet her."
Yeah.
I haven't yet, but maybe one day, and I will not be creepy and tell her that I have 4 editions of her book sitting on display in my living room.
Everybody listening to this podcast right now, go ahead, put it out there in the world. Put it out in the world. We got it. Time for a meetup right there, and make sure to tell them it's 4 copies of the. No, I'm just kidding.
She could be like, "Oh god, did you hear about that creepy author?"
No, no. Well, I mean, let's be honest. If you put yourself in her shoes, say 5, 10 years from now, somebody comes up to you who's a writer and says that they have 4 different versions and copies of your books, would you feel a little creeped out, or would you be like, "That's really cool"?
Yes, I would think it was cool, but I'm also a weird person though, so I'm not sure if I can trust my judgment.
All right, fair enough. Do you ever look to other genres for inspiration as well?
Hmm, that's a good question. So Ironcast is a historical fantasy, so I read a lot of historical fiction, mostly from the 20s, but I also went into like the 30s and 40s while I was researching for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually my only book that I had to do extensive research in because my other ones are either high fantasy or contemporary fantasy. Um, so that one definitely, I had to draw a lot of inspiration from historical fiction,
Okay.
and just the way that it gets presented. And I had never read a lot of historical fiction before that, and a lot of times during the writing of it was like, why am I doing this again? I haven't read, like, there's not even any historical fiction on my shelves. So it was actually really exciting because it helped me to sort of expand my horizons and network with a lot of authors that I otherwise would not have met who were outside of my normal circle. So that was really fun.
I found authors come together quite a bit and are very supportive of each other, and I think that's really cool. And so I really honestly think that that's something that is seen a lot amongst authors, is supporting each other and talking to each other, and like you had said. Let's talk a little bit about Ironcast. How did this book kind of come to being? You mentioned that it's kind of a historical fiction, a historical fantasy, and why? How does this different from, say, like an urban fantasy set in the 20s?
Um, I mean, I guess it's a little bit semantics. You could call it an urban fantasy
Okay.
set in the 20s. I wouldn't be opposed to that. It's the sort of idea, the general idea of the magic system, which is uh, the concept that magic is channeled via different forms of creative arts. So, um, artists and poets and musicians all can channel very specific forms of magic, but that magic has been made illegal, sort of mirroring prohibition. So, which forces them to go underground and sort of do these magic speakeasies. And that's the sort of concept of the magic system had started off as like a contemporary fantasy idea, actually,
Okay.
that I'd written a very rough draft of. And the more I thought about it, the more I honestly don't remember how it happened. It just like occurred to me that like it would be perfect set during Prohibition because it would be the perfect mirror
Yeah.
um, of that time period. And just like a really good vehicle for sort of exploring some of the ideas of that time period. So yeah, so then I was like, okay, well, why not? Let's do the Roaring Twenties. I can always like change it if I want to. And then I got halfway through and was like, okay, yeah, this is working. This is what it needs to be. But then I was like, oh crap, now I have to like actually learn about the 20s
Right.
as opposed to just like my knowledge was literally just the fact that I had watched the movie version of the musical Chicago 100 times in high school.
uh, love it.
And I was like, I probably need a little bit more information than that about the 20s.
Is there anything from this book? Because obviously your first book going in, there's all kinds of firsts. You know, your first getting it published and getting it out there, and first, reviews and all that kind of stuff. Is there first editing process? Was there anything that you learned a lot from this book that you still to this day go back and go, okay, I did this and this thing. This is what I learned. Any major things that you learned in that doing that book?
I mean, one of the main things that I learned, and I think probably most authors have a similar experience, is just that the reality of publishing is always going to be different than your expectations. And you sort of have to find a balance between hoping for the best, then also don't let your hopes and dreams be crushed by the wheel of publishing because it loves to crush people under its weight. Um, so it's like it's a very delicate balance, and honestly, like it's the sort of thing where you learn it the hard way the first time because you don't really have a choice. It just kind of comes and hits you in the face, but then you have to keep relearning it for every book afterwards. So yeah, so I'd say it's something that I learned for the first time then, but I would not say that I have learned the lesson now and no longer have any problems
Right.
with getting my hopes up too high or anything like that.
That's fair enough. What is your favorite thing about the Ironcast? If you could pick one thing that like you loved about that book, whether it's art or a story or a specific character development or whatever it is, what's one thing that you're like you really love about that particular book?
Probably the friendship between the two main characters, Corinne and Ada. They have a true ride or die friendship. And I just really loved writing that a lot. And it really meant a lot to me to have a book with two female characters who had that strong of a friendship because I have that sort of a friendship in my life with my best friend. And so I was like, I want to see that in a book,
Yeah,
that really true, like, just, all the way, doesn't matter what happens, we've got each other's back. So that was really fun to write and really meant a lot to me that it was in, my first published book.
some the next couple books you had, Fire with Fire and Beneath the Citadel, how do those kind of differ from Ironcast?
So Beneath the Citadel is high fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
and it's an ensemble cast. But I mean, it does have a lot in common with Ironcast. There's sort of the heist element to it, although the heist is the bigger, more central in Beneath the Citadel than it was in Ironcast. And then it has a lot about found family and friendships and the way that you can, blood doesn't always define who your family is. You can choose. Um, so that's not answering your question because I just told you how they were similar, but
That's okay. That's okay. What
but it's the
go
same with Fire with Fire, where it's although Fire with Fire is more about blood family because it's about two sisters.
Yeah.
And I have a sister of my own. So it was a lot, not 100% based on our relationship, but sort of the dynamics of what it's like to have a sister. So that was something that I really explored in that one, and that was really fun.
Do you ever write characters? Speaking of that and having the sisters and whatnot, do you have a lot of characters that you're like, I'm writing this character and this is the person I am picturing, and I'm just writing them into the page in your books? I know a lot of authors do that, and some of them say, no, I try my best not to do that. Do you have any of that where somebody opens a book and if they know you, they like, oh, hey, I know this person?
If I did, I wouldn't admit it. Because what if they hated that character? But I don't though. I don't. I might take aspects of relationship, or I might take certain character traits of like my friends, or even more often I'll take a character trait of theirs and then kind of twist it to fit the story a little bit better. So I'd be lying if I said that the people in my life have no, effect on me and don't inspire me at
Right.
all.
Right.
But you wouldn't be able to pick any of them out of a book.
Yeah.
The exception being that in Fire with Fire, I actually used two of my really good friends' names as like a throwaway line of some like dragon hunters, because I was just writing the first draft and I was like, "Oh, I need to put some names." And so I just like literally put their names in there and then came around to edits and I was like, I asked them, I was like, "Do you mind if I just leave it? Leave your name?" And they're like, "Sure." And then I used my aunt. She's a high school chemistry teacher. And at one point in the book, I reference a high school chemistry teacher, and I was like, "Well, I might as well, use Miss Word because that's her name." And when she found that out, she started reading that portion of the book to all of her classes, just to be like, "Look, I'm in a book."
That's good. It's free publicity, right? Just doing it to the
Yeah.
classes, and now all those classes are like, "Oh, I'm really interested in this book." See, there you go. It
Yep.
works out.
She does her part on my publicity team.
Where kind of skipping around a little bit here, people can see that are in our live stream can see scrolling images of the covers of your books. The covers of some of those books are just so fantastic. Did you go to different cover artists? Did the publishers come up with the cover arts for some of your books? Did you have any say in that? Kind of walk us through that process.
So for my books, and this is usually the case with traditional publishing, I was not the one who came up with any of the designs or the cover artists or anything. My publisher, they usually publishers, just speaking generally, will ask, what are some, cover comps that you like, different books that have sort of the same vibe as you would want on your cover. And then they might take that under consideration or they might completely ignore it. Sort of their prerogative.
Right.
So yeah, so mine, I just got really lucky in that all of mine, I think, have been really spectacular covers, and I could really tell that the design team and the cover artist really put a lot of care and thought into the design and into like understanding the book itself before they didn't just slap a cover on it.
Right.
You could tell that they really understood what the book was about. So I felt like I got really lucky, but I didn't have anything to do with it. I cannot take any credit for any of them.
Well, you wrote the book, so that's the credit you get.
that's
But honestly,
that's all I can do.
covers sell books. I don't know how many times I've picked up a book and looked at the cover and go, I'm getting this, and then read the back. And long before anybody ever suggests anything, you go in and you walk through and you look at the covers and see what's
Hmm.
oh, that's got a wizard on it. That's really cool. That's got a really cool skull, digital motif. Like that's really awesome. Or it's got this really cool like artsy dragon picture in the case of Fire with Fire. So yeah, it's really awesome covers. I love
Yeah.
them all. I think they're great, and yeah, you definitely did luck out on getting some amazing covers there.
Yeah, it really works in my favor with, social media, because a lot of times you just get that split second of somebody scrolling.
Yeah,
And so I feel like all of my covers sort of give the bonus of people pausing to give them a second look, which is nice.
and that's always something I use when I'm doing some of these shows, because obviously part of it is to promote you, the guest. And so some people don't necessarily know who you are. And so it's really cool for
Mhm.
me to go, here's some covers of some of the things that they've done. And either A, they go, oh, I recognize that book, or B, that's a really cool book cover. I got to check out what it is. So it's a win win. And so social media, like you said, you put it out there and, it draws people in. And those definitely are some great covers. So when we're talking about Fire with Fire and Beneath the Citadel, I want to do the same thing I did for Ironcast. What is your favorite thing about each of those two books? If you could just pick one.
Ooh. Um, Probably with Beneath the Citadel, probably the main character, Casa, who is um, the the inspiration for her character was kind of the concept of like the asshole genius, which is typically a archetype that is dominated by men. So you see it like with like Sherlock Holmes or any number of
Right.
male characters who are really jerks, but they're really smart and they're always right, so they get away with it.
Yeah.
Um, and I was like, I want to write that kind of because I like that kind of character. I'm not ashamed to admit that I will always like that kind of character. And I was like, but I want a girl to be able to do that. I want a girl to be able to just sort of be an unapologetic asshole, but like she's a genius and like her ideas work.
Yeah.
So she's allowed to be a little bit of an asshole. Which is not to say her friends don't call her out on some of her bullshit, but so I had a really fun time writing her. And then Fire with Fire, I mean, I already talked about it, but like writing the relationship between the two sisters, between Danny and Eden, was really my favorite part about it because I'd never really written dragons before, seriously. And that was actually my first contemporary fantasy. So I'd never really written in contemporary before. So it was like all this stuff that was really new to me, but their relationship, like I said, I have a sister. So the relationship felt like something I already knew, like really deep down. So just putting it out on the page was really fun for me and really kind of wrestling with different dynamics of how you can love somebody so completely and yet they are the person who can drive you the most crazy out of every other person in the world.
Yeah. And
So
people can relate to
that was
that.
really fun. Hmm.
So your new book, Thief Liar Lady, uh, is out now, right? It's out, and people can get it
Yes.
now. What?
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about this book. Tell us the premise of it, if you will.
So it is a Cinderella retelling in which Cinderella and her quote unquote evil step family are actually con artists who are grifting the royal family. That's my elevator pitch. And I have found that that's usually all I have to say
Yeah.
before people say, oh, okay.
I'm
Yeah.
in. I'm in. What can people look forward to with this book?
um, as with all of my books, there is an excess of witty banter.
Yes.
Um, there is a female lead who is kind of an asshole sometimes, but she's really smart, so she can get away with it. Um, there's very complicated sister slash stepsister dynamics in there. That was really fun to write. There is a very good dog who plays an important part, steals the show, I would say, on occasion. There is only one bed at one point, which is one of my favorite tropes, and I was so happy that my editor let me keep it. And other than that, just lots of intrigue and murder and lying, or I've said before, lots of thieving and liaring and ladying.
And when you explain it like that and you look at the title, it's like, oh, I get it now. I get it. That's great. When you're putting together this book, because you mentioned this one is more of an adult book, how much of a divide is that between the other books that you've written and then now this one going from young adult to adult? And was that a difficult transition for you?
It was not a super difficult transition because I read a lot of YA and adult novels, and I already sort of had um, every author will have a different idea in their head of what the difference is between
Right.
like their YA and their adult. So for me, it is that my YA novels tend to be more hopeful because when you're a teenager, you still got your whole life ahead of you. Um, you're ready to take on the world and you're learning all these new things about the world. And so for me, it's really important to like maintain that hopefulness that you have as a teenager, that idea of like I can change things. Um, and that sort of empowerment. So it's really important to me to keep that in my YA novels because that's who I'm writing for, is for the teenagers.
Right.
In my adult novel, it shifts because I think once you're an adult, you just have a different mindset about the world. There are lots of things that you know that you can't change and that you'll never be able to change. And part of being an adult is learning to recognize those things and learning how to live with it, and how to still, make a difference in your own way. And so for me, that was the big thing with The Flyer Lady, is that um, there's a lot of aspects of it that are, a little bit depressing because it's like, okay, there's not like this perfect happy ending where justice prevails and everything is fair, because the world isn't fair. But we just kind of all have to do the best we can, and hold on to the people that we love. And so for me, that was the big difference in writing them.
Would you say that's kind of like the main thing you want people to walk away from after reading this book, is to get that sense of like life is life and you do the best you can? Or do you think that there's
Yeah.
something else, some more other things or something bigger that they can take away from this book?
No, I think that would be a fair, if you just walked away with life is life, do the best you can and hold on to the people you love, that is, I would be happy with that.
That's great. That's great. Do you have any plans on making any sequels or series to this book or any of your previous books?
No. Generally, in traditional publishing, that just kind of depends on if the publisher wants a sequel or a series, and mine don't. There's a lot of factors. Typically, it just has to
Mm-hmm.
do with how well the book sells, and if there's good potential there. So, it's not really up to me, but yeah, no sequels are planned. I guess I could write one if I wanted to, but just have to like post it on, I
Yeah,
don't know,
somewhere
on my
self-publish it
website.
or something. Yeah, 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 yeah. What other books do you got? Do you have anything else on the horizon? Stuff you're working on? Stuff you have coming out? Uh, Coming up down the road?
I do. I have my next adult novel with Del Rey. It does not have a title yet. It is, I think, coming out in 2024. We'll see. That was the scheduled date, but publishing changes in the
Right.
blink of an eye. The pitch for it that sold it to my editor is that it is The Good Witch meets You've Got Mail. So it is a contemporary fantasy rom-com, just like a witchy rom-com, very different from anything else I've ever written, because it was my pandemic book
Oh,
that
okay.
I started writing while Thief Liar Lady was on sub with different editors. And I was just like, I'm tired and depressed and lonely. And I had COVID at that point for a long time. Um, and so I was like, I just want to write something that I've never written before, that's really happy, that I'm not thinking about anybody else ever reading it. It's just for me, just for fun. Um, so that was really fun to draft, but that is why it is so different from anything else that I've ever written. But it was really fun. And then, when I told my editor about it, she was like, "Yeah, let's do that for your next book." And I was like, "Okay, I guess that means people are going to read it now. I hope they like it."
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. Do you have any other genres that you really want to try and write? Something you're like, I really want to branch out and try and write in this genre or that genre sometime down the road?
I I maybe would like to try my hand at writing horror because I love reading horror. I don't know if I would be any good at writing it because I haven't really tried. But that's definitely pipe dream of like maybe one day I'll be brave enough to like try my hand at writing a horror manuscript. We'll see.
That's kind of a fun way of putting it. Someday I'll be brave enough to do horror. Listen, Destiny, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you being here. I know the listeners are going to have a great time and have had a great time thus far listening to this episode. So I appreciate you coming by.
Thanks for having me. It's been really fun.
You can be found at destinysoria.com, correct?
Yes.
And you're on Instagram, the Destiny Soria, Soria, for those that are listening.
That is right.
Awesome. Guys, go and check it out. Go into the website. Go and find all the books. Buy all the books. Purchase all the books. If you're on Audible, go into Audible and get your books on Audible. Or, say hello on Instagram. Go and give follows and keep up with all of the things. I want to remind everybody that September 11th, we're going to be joined by the voice of Scooby-Doo and Shaggy, Scott Innes. He does all kinds of voice acting as well as radio. We're going to talk about his career, his convention schedule, how he got his job doing these voices, and way more. So that podcast will be available for download September 12th. Again, live September 11th. Also coming up, we've got all kinds of guests coming up. Author Retsy Bruno's got a lot of stuff out there is coming up, multiple genres. That's going to be on September 25th. New York Times bestselling author and actor Wesley Chu's going to be joining us. Urban fantasy author Heather Harris is going to be joining us October 23rd. The winner of the 2023 Diane Jones Award for RPGs, Connor Alexander, is going to be joining us on November 6th. The author of the D&D Cookbook, Michael Whitwer, is going to be joining us. All kinds of people. So stay tuned. Click all the buttons. Follow everything. Subscribe. Click all of those buttons. It helps us and helps our guests. So for Destiny, I am Nick. Thank you for listening to Epic Realms.